This is Jerry Barrett talking. Today's date is March 25th, 1986. I'm interviewing John MacDonald in his office at Eastern Airline headquarters in Miami. John, if you would, could you talk a little bit about what you did before you came with Eastern Airlines?
Well, I'm from Connecticut originally, and went to school in Connecticut, graduated from college, and worked for several years for a unit of Allied stores. Actually, it was a chain within a chain up there, and went through a variety of areas and departments and wound up in their personnel office.
Huh.
In '65, I came with Eastern in Miami, moved down from Connecticut, and worked in the regional employment office at the time, and I started off doing things like flight attendant, pilot recruiting, and gradually moved into various areas outside of employment. I worked in the policy section for a while. I worked in 4 personnel offices around the system. I was involved with the acquisition of Caribbean Airlines in '72 to '74 on a special assignment, Puerto Rico. Came back, and I had a variety of human resource type jobs that involved recruiting and staff support for regional personnel offices and employee services and a whole variety of things. I wound up in labor relations in mid-October of 1981. And that was a point which was good. I didn't think so at the time, but it was good. I started one day, and I think we started negotiations about 2 days later. A lot of the staff work was done at the time, or I'd say about 70% of it in preparation for it. So it wasn't as much of a hassle as I thought it was going to be, but I was able to learn a lot in a very, very short period of time. And I worked for Dwayne Andrews at that time, who was our chief negotiator.
Okay. Who were you negotiating with at that point?
We were negotiating with the mechanic, for the mechanic-related contract with the IAM.
Okay.
That expired on December 31 of 1981. And it was a very interesting time because that was the first contract that Mr. Bryan and his new regime with the IM negotiated with Eastern. They had some pretty strong ideas and what they thought the company could afford to pay and how they wanted to change the whole concept negotiations. And what they wanted out of us, and I found it fascinating from my own first time in negotiations. I can remember the initial exchange of proposals, and he had something like 300 and something, which included very out of ridiculous items like health spas for employees and things like that. It was also interesting because the union at that time, and it's first that I can recall here at Eastern, maybe in industry, being very public-minded and press-minded, and they did a lot of things in the newspapers. There was constant articles back and forth in the Miami Herald about what the company thought their economic position was, and then 2 days later, there would be something in there from the union saying that Eastern's always talking doom and gloom. There was plenty of money to spread around, and they wanted their fair share, and it just was a constant thing back and forth. It might be interesting for you to pull out those old clippings. I don't know if we have them here, but you could probably get them from the Miami Herald and make fascinating reading.
Was there any effort on the part of the parties to minimize that?
We discussed in the initial sessions of negotiations that we were going to try and minimize that. We made commitments to each other, but it never seemed to really work. There was always jockeying for position. There was always things that the company would put out financially as a normal course of reaction, a course of business that the union would react to. So it never really worked the way we had all hoped it would. And it was really counter to, I think, to the IM's position. They wanted to educate their membership, and they did so internally within their own organization. I think they did it externally as well. They were on talk shows, and it was amazing. It was amazing. As I said, it was very interesting and kind of overwhelming to see that we were going to be airing our dirty linen in public like that. But that was, I guess, the start of a trend that's continued till today. We negotiated for about 18 months, from November, actually 17 months, until the end of March 1983, and seesawed back and forth. In February, we were released from the National Mediation Board.
This is
February of 83.
83, okay.
And we were in a countdown and negotiated during that period of time with the quote, assistance of a mediator. And I believe it was March 27th. No, it had to be earlier. It was March 7th, I believe, somewhere around that time, that we made a last-minute offer to the IM, fully realizing at that time that we had financial problems and considerations, number one, for the basis of our offer, and number two, that we felt that the offer that we made was substantially a change from what they already had in previous proposals, and therefore right up to their strike vote, so that they would, under their constitution, be obligated to take that out again.
For a vote?
For a vote of the membership. There were a lot of people here, including myself, that thought that the employees were sensitive enough to the economic problems that they probably would have bought into that. They didn't. Shortly thereafter, we said that we couldn't negotiate with them any further when they came back to us. And we were invited up to the National Mediation Board headquarters in Washington to complete negotiations towards a deadline that then moved, I believe, to March 27th. We initially resisted that, and afterwards, after a couple of days, said we'd go up and listen, but we didn't have any more money to negotiate. During the course of this period of the countdown and preparations for strikes, we had a lot of people around here, and it's still affecting people here today. They got very hyped up about going on strike. They wanted to strike. Not the IAM so much, but the other people around them, the pilots, the non-contract, the management people.
They wanted the machinists to go on strike, or they?
Yeah, they wanted to take them on. They thought that this was something that we could do and that we could operate and that we could finally get some reason into our employee workforce as far as that group is concerned. And it was kind of frightening. I can remember describing some of the people after a meeting in an auditorium as a bunch of kamikazes. They didn't realize what they were getting themselves in for. We hadn't been in a strike since 1966 and rocked along without any serious work problems, work stoppages, and I still don't think they had any idea what they were facing. Even today, I periodically hear, well, if we took them on then, it would have been all over. But it would have been over. It would have been all over for a variety of reasons. Because once we did finally change our proposal and get concurrence on an agreement, we were able to determine that at least we were advised that we didn't have the cash to pull off a strike, and I believe that was a pretty tough time. I think the settlement reinforced in the membership's mind, at least, that some of the things that Mr. Bryan had been saying and District 100 was saying about the company having money may have been true. But that reality soon came to that situation because they ratified the contract on April 8th. And in June, we were back asking them for additional money as far as a bond program.
The point you're making there is that the Brian had been saying all along that the company had more money.
Yeah.
When they were able to make a settlement, then the membership said Bryant was right.
I think for a while
Yeah.
they felt that way, and as I said, when we came back and we started talking about debentures, I think Brian realized that there was a need at that point. Although the best he would do would be a voluntary program, and there weren't many takers.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, we got into the fall of 1983 in September and October, where there was threats of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Just before, as I recall, and just in more pronounced afterwards, after the Continental situation. And we had a lot of problems at that time. And there were still comments made by the IAM that this was not factual, that it was not true, and that we didn't have the problems we thought or we claimed that we had. And then you turn around and we got an agreement, and it was an 18% wage program in 1984. It always amazed me that how he could jump back and forth as a union leader and have any credibility at all, saying we had plenty of money and no, we don't have any money, and we have plenty of money, no, we don't have any money. But I guess he can do that sort of stuff. In '84, during our wage investment program, I think as far as labor relations was concerned, it's probably the easiest time that we've had in this area. There was a realization, at least early on in the year, that we did have a great many problems financially, and that what we had been doing since '81 was fighting each other continuously, and that was contributing to the problem, and both from a potential revenue loss out of there, but also our operating problems were getting to be such that we couldn't let that continue. We really got involved with employee involvement, both from a structured point of view and what we call EI, large EI, which would be the structure, little EI, which would be the management and the employees in a particular area working together to solve some problems. And a lot of things got done.
During '84.
A lot of things got done. There was a lot of things that were done in order to get more things done. Some of the things that you look back now, particularly bringing work in that we had historically contracted out, that may not have been such a good idea, but it was something that we thought that could be looked upon as something the company was trying to take a couple of steps forward on to bring some other things on board. And it was a very pleasant time as far as Eastern was concerned. Then in the fall of '84, we had to negotiate another contract. And that contract was the one that we signed in '83, expired December 31, 1984, and at the same time, we had a variable earnings program, which was the 18% program where the employees were able to buy 25% of the stock. And that was up on the 31st. It was our intention, our hope, and we thought our commitment that we would be able to look at where we were financially 30 days before the end of the year, and that was in the agreement that we discussed. Sit down with the union and decide on a course of action to ensure the company's financial viability. Well, when we started to get into negotiations, they didn't want to talk about it. Matter of fact, they flatly refused to talk about it. They said, we're in negotiations for a new contract. We're not in negotiations for a wage investment program. So we said, okay, we'll adjourn negotiations until we can take care of the wage investment program, and they absolutely refused to do so, knowing full well, in my, or should have known full well, in my belief, that the total amount of the wages was something in for the program in '84, and this is all groups, was something like 276 or 296 million. That nothing miraculously happened in 1984 that would allow us to put those wages back in 1985 and then even build upon those. But they flatly refused to do it. It caused us some more problems because in the latter part of December 1984, we made a decision that we could not afford to put the 18% back into employees' wages, and advised them that we would continue to deduct that under the status quo provisions of the Railway Labor Act. Well, there were some very interesting times in early January, because the unions, all three of them, had told people and made commitments to people that they were going to get that money back. And it was only after the efforts of Bill Ussery during January, where he proposed and everyone agreed that as a symbolic act we would put the wages back in January in order to get us to a point where we would start meeting again, start negotiating again to resolve not only the contracts that we had open, but to resolve a problem we had with our lenders that had to be resolved by the 31st of January. And we got back together and discussed, but really never accomplished a great deal as far as I was concerned. At that point, one of the big things, as I recall, the IM wanted to do was have a program of revenue sharing. And as the revenue of the corporation would increase, they would continue to get a portion of that devoted to the wages of the IM. And that came about because apparently in the early 60s, early to mid 60s, I believe somewhere in excess of 40% of our expense dollar, and actually revenues, were devoted to wage and salaries for all employees. Mm-hmm. And about 12% of that at one point was for the IM. They wanted to maintain that, and had found that over the course of the years it had dropped down to 36% of gross revenues, and the IM had gone down to maybe 10%. And sometimes dipping below that, depending where we were in the contract and what gross revenues were. We tried to convince them that had no relation to reality in the marketplace as far as our survival was concerned, and that it wasn't revenues that determined your survival, but how much money you made. And they had maintained then, and had maintained even in the 81, 82, 83 negotiations, that profitability was something the company could control and manipulate, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it. We went all the way up to January 31, negotiated very hard and very long, and was not able to reach an agreement with the IM. They still felt that they could get more out of the company than we were willing to do. And as a matter of fact, they were convinced that they could get a full restoration of their wages in 1985. Well, we were in technical default as of midnight on the 31st, and that was a very interesting day. A lot of animosity.
Between the...
Bewitching hour between the union and the company.
Oh, yeah.
Not a great deal of shouting. There was a little bit. I was convinced that within a matter of a couple of days, somebody was going to try and grab something, our assets, and that we probably would file Chapter 11. I had, in addition to being in negotiations at that time, I had since mid-December also been involved with the exercise of Chapter 11, so I could say it was parallel. You know, if I wasn't in negotiation, I was doing that, and it was a scary time because I could see that we weren't making any real progress in negotiations, but we were making a real progress in a preparation for Chapter 11.
Yes.
So that gave everybody a little adrenaline pumping there for a couple of days, and then Bill Ussery again came back with a proposal that he tried to get everybody agree to, and at least it brought them back to the table and to get an agreement in principle. And by the way, none of the unions reached agreement on January 31st. We were very close and probably could have gotten an agreement with the pilots and maybe the flight attendants. Excuse me, I wasn't in those negotiations, but I know at midnight we did not have one.
But the difficult one at this point was the machinists.
Yes.
Yes, most.
It was difficult from a couple of reasons, really, because in 1984, as part of the wage investment program, every one of the union groups had made a commitment that they were going to increase their productivity by 5%, and that was how they were going to do that was going to be announced. And the IM went out and did a lot of work as far as where we could gain cost savings by doing things a little bit different way, and they exceeded that when the pilots and the flight attendants didn't do anything. So the IM felt that they had every right to feel that they ought to be treated totally different than the other groups who did not meet this commitment, and that their salaries and wages could be snapped back, while the other groups, well, that's their problem. You know, they didn't meet their commitments, we did, so we ought to be treated differently.
Was that pretty accurate, though, that they had made some legitimate productivity?
About $30 million worth, yeah. And it was counted by the company. You know,
Right.
I'm not sure what figure they would come up with, but it was agreed to. There was $29,400,000 or something, and they did, yeah.
What was the nature of some of these things?
Nature of it a lot of it was contracting in items,
Huh.
or there were different processes. For example, as I recall, there was one that had to do with blades. We used to scrap a lot of engine blades in our engine shop, and somebody came up with a process that says, hey, you can repair them, and instead of throwing away and buying new ones at $80, let's say, you could repair them for $2.10 or something. And there were a lot of items like that. And there still exists a pretty comprehensive list.
And the company is the one that did the costing on it, and they were satisfied that it was, that it approached $30 million. Okay. So that was the basis for the machinists feeling they should be treated differently, that they had kind of paid their dues, in effect. The other unions probably wouldn't agree with that. But
Yeah, well, the other unions, I'm sure, didn't agree, especially the pilots, though I haven't talked to any of them, but a lot of the other people on the base said, hey, yes, they did come up with $30 million, and that's very good, but they probably cost us a heck of a lot more than that each year over the years by their lack of productivity. And not because of the contract, it's just a work ethic problem, especially on this base, that things just don't seem to be able to get done. But at any rate, we got back together after Bill Ussery put his recommendations together, sat down, and I think we got together on the 3rd or 4th of February, and were able to hammer out a verbal agreement by the 8th. And it was an agreement. except that for the next 2 months or so, or at least the next 6 weeks, we argued what that agreement really meant, because it wasn't written down. And because of the strange way things are done in the airline industry, that agreement, to the best of my knowledge, and I wasn't in the negotiation process, and I don't think anybody from the company and union were sitting across from each other when that was reached. That was reached in the middle of the night and during the course of a following day when Jack Johnson was in my estimation, and I've never really talked to Jack about this, this might be an area you could explore with him, that was in one room with Bill Ussery. The union was in another room with their advisors, and Bill was going back and forth, and one of our investment bankers was going back and forth. And from subsequent meetings and discussions on what the substance of the disagreement was the comments, well, I told so-and-so this, and Johnson would say, well, yes, I heard something like this, but this is what I understood when I talked with him. So it was never a very clear thing with the parties sitting together and understanding what they were going to do. And I have every reason to believe that Mr. Bryan, at least on one of the items, on a profit sharing for 1985, exaggerated his thoughts on it, and indicated to me, because of some unclear language in the way the Ussery proposal was written, that it was going to be a profit sharing plan that would last multiple years when it was only supposed to last one. And I believe he understood that. I really did. My negotiation notes from the first couple of sessions after we reached that tentative agreement, and it became apparent that at least on one portion, the restoration or the increase, we thought it was a 5% increase in base wages. They said it was a 5% restoration, the difference being about 1%. The area of profit sharing, to the best of my knowledge, never came up as an area of dispute. And it was only after a couple of weeks that somebody must have said, gee, that's not very clear. What does it mean? That's my opinion. But we went along discussing the tentative agreement, and part of that process was determining how we were going to give the IAM credit for an additional productivity items, and how they were going to be counted, and how they were going to relate back to a restoration of wages. And that took at least a month of a lot of meetings. And there was a lot of distrust, apparently, from the IM side, a lot of concern on the company side that some of the things that they wanted to do were not going to be totally above board and honest. At least there was some indication, even after we reached the agreement, in my opinion, that they had taken a position that was contrary to what we decided. As a matter of fact, I proved it to them at one time, but that's another story for another time. We went through 85 after we reached the agreement.
Eventually that was all committed to writing?
Eventually. Eventually. I think the actual principles of agreement that were the handshake agreement, where the parties weren't there to understand what they were shaking hands about, was finalized in the very last moments of negotiation on 31st of March, April 1st of the year of 85. So it took that long. Now, admittedly, most of the items in there were agreed to with exception of the profit sharing plan, but it wasn't signed off until that particular time. We got into after completing the agreement, we got into a ratification process where we printed some of the things for the IM, and they brought it out, and it was defeated. And it was defeated, from what I understand from the unions, because they didn't have enough time to really get out there and sell it. They did not want to change the agreement, neither did we. We were up against a problem with bankers. We were in technical default, and they said, okay, we'll give you until this date, we'll give you until this date. And there were a number of things that were all coming together in April where we had to get agreements with everybody, or we were going to lose our credibility with the financial community and suffer whatever consequences that would have. They rejected it, the union, and we did not want to change it. We did come out with a couple of letters of agreement on what things meant, and made some minor modifications, very, very, very minor, and put it out again, and it was ratified.
What time frame are we getting to now? Early summer? By the time it was...
The second ratification vote was May 9th.
Oh.
And we received notification of ratification on the 16th of May. So we had an agreement there, and moved along trying to recapture some of the things that we did in '84 as far as working together was concerned, and trying to identify as many projects as we could to get back into a restoration process so they could start getting some money back. I think everybody by and large were desirous of that happening, but turn of events indicated that probably wasn't the best way to go, but that's, hindsight is always 20/20. We did make a number of work rule changes in the IM contract.
In '85, okay.
In '85. I can't tell you the total value offhand, but what we did do is we gave those IM employees, the mechanic and related, credit for them as far as restoration of wages. In other words, when we changed, for one example was the number of shift starting times at airports. We went from 6 to 8. And we determined what that difference was in dollars, and we credited them for wage restoration, and they got wage increases based on that. But there were a number of items there. There was one of the larger items was a new entry rate. We called it a B scale, but it really was more of an entry rate because they merged. And I know there's merging two tiers and merging B scales, but it wasn't the true B scale that we started off with. So they got a lot of credit for that, and they got a 5% increase as part of the initial agreement on February 1 because of some of the cost savings devices and contractual work rule changes. They got a 4% increase on April 1, 1985. Then things began to become very difficult as far as getting additional cost savings from areas that they could influence towards additional restorations. At that point, let's see, they were at in April 1, they were at 91% of what we call salary of record, which were the contractual rates. That's the contractual rate minus 18%, 5% restoration, 4% restoration in April. So you just kept subtracting. But it became more and more difficult. There became there began a period of time of greater tension because of their submitting various cost savings areas that just didn't work. That the money wasn't there, or it was something they couldn't influence. And in August of '85, it became apparent, I believe, to everyone that we were about at the end of the line with that cost savings. There was a 1.1% restoration increase on July 1, 1985, and in my belief, and from what I understand, that was a generous determination of what the actual cost savings were. Based upon that difficulty in getting the restorations, and based upon other contractual agreements that the IAM, the International, had reached with other carriers, we started to look at where our salaries or our wages were going to be at the end of our contract, and then we determined we were going to be way out of whack. So we started to get concerned about being far out of whack as far as our top end of the wages, and because we're a very senior workforce, a lot of our people are up there. It was and it still is a concern, and because of the fact that there were recognitions that it was going to be increasingly more difficult to get any sort of wage restoration through the cost-saving process. The IAM and the company got together and said, okay, we'll swap the wage restoration portion for a adjustment in the wages, and it was about a 5% decrease, as I remember. And as part of that, there will be a full restoration 1/1/86. Now you have to remember that the wages didn't change in 1/1/86 in the contract. It's just a restoration formula. It was 91 in April. It went to 92.5, and the top mechanic, for example, during all of 1985 was at 1740. They weren't paid 1740. They were paid 87% of that, 91%,
Okay.
92.5. But on January 1 of 86, it was still 1740, so we advanced it 7.5% to make it 100% on the basis of no cost savings for adjustments for the following 2 years of the contract that were a little less than we had originally agreed to. That agreement was put together and it was ratified by the membership on October 17th, 1985. Now you have to remember a couple things about 85. We started a year off with a very, very uncertain future. Then we had a Pan American strike and a United Airlines strike. And I think at the same time probably an upsurge in our traffic over and above those two things. So we were carrying a lot of people, and we were making a lot of money. Matter of fact, the first 6 months of the year, we had the greatest first half earnings in our history. So things looked pretty rosy there for a while. And the agreement that we reached with the IAM, which started the discussions in August, the end of August and proceeded in September, didn't look that bad. And we figured we can solve a problem at the end of the contract. Well, in September, probably in the latter part of August and September, was the start of a serious decline in yield. And there were fare wars breaking out all over the place. So we had a disastrous September. And October looked pretty disastrous, and it turned out to be. And from going from a position where we had made so much money in the first 6 months and had put aside a lot of money for profit sharing, it was eroding very, very quickly. And we knew that we were in trouble again. And I was not involved with any of the informal discussions with Mr. Bryan, but he was advised that the situation was deteriorating, and he knew from being a member of the board of directors what was happening. Whether he could recognize the real reasons for it, or thought it might have been some type of strategy the company was playing to beat him down on wages, which he continually thought and still thinks, I'm sure. I'm not sure, but we had a deadline as far as from our bankers again on February 28th. I believe that in my own heart that we had set these deadlines and bankers had set these deadlines, and nothing had ever really happened. Now, we were in default in February 1 of 1985. Nothing changed. And we didn't get out of default until spring, at some point in spring, perhaps even May, and did not meet the requirements to get out of default, have agreements in place with all the unions. We still had the flight attendants and the pilots. So I don't think that Mr. Bryan or his membership really looked at the February 28th date, at least in late '85, as anything more than some date the company concocted to strip away some of their wages. We continue to try to get him to open the contract, at least initially to open the contract, and at least just to amend those sections relating to wages, vacations, and benefits, and he refused to do it. And we got to the point where we were, at least the board of directors felt, and I could understand their feeling, that they had an obligation as stockholders to either fix it, tank it, or sell it, and they elected to sell it. And that's where we are today. Actually, we're the same place we were a couple of months ago, because we still like to open the contract, because we still have the same problems. Regardless who owns us, we have to be able to compete with people out there carrying passengers.
And the contract really with the machinist has not really been opened.
No, it is not.
Even to the date we're talking here.
That's correct.
Was there a lot of, well, you wouldn't be directly involved in this, but I'm sure you heard from your colleagues in management, a lot of dissension among the other two unions when the handwriting apparently was on the wall, but yet the machinists refused to open their agreement in the fall and spring of '87,
Well,
'86.
What happened was that the pilots in particular, have always felt that they have been in the forefront of any concessions to the company. They've been out in front. When the IM wouldn't buy into things, they were out there doing things, and they felt that in '85, and I'm sure they felt the same way in '86, that they wanted to see what the machinists were going to do. They want to know what Charlie was going to do before they start doing it.
Yeah.
And what's Charlie going to do? What's Charlie going to do? That's a common question. And it wasn't really a matter of what Charlie was going to do. You know, their contracts were up. They had expired, both the flight attendants and the pilots. And they had an obligation to reach an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Charlie didn't. We thought that in the best interest of the company, and to keep it from being sold, or more likely at the point going Chapter 11, that he would see clear to join the party. He didn't.
Yeah. Down there toward the end, was there suspicion that he really would cave in at the end and go to the party?
I thought he would. I thought that at the last minute he probably would, but But you know, I guess maybe I'm just an optimist. I thought he was going to do the same thing in 1985. I thought they all were. You know, I didn't think anybody would be crazy enough to say, "Hey, we've got 40,000 jobs. The hell with them. Let them go." And I thought that if they were misreading if they were reading incorrectly, the bankers to just set up another deadline. That was dangerous, because I think that in my opinion, that the banks lost a great deal of credibility in 1985 by sitting around doing nothing. And I don't think, and from what I heard, they were about to let that happen again. You don't make threats and you don't set deadlines without doing anything, especially in the financial community.
So in early '86, then, the suspicion was that the banks really would take some actions, repossess some airplanes, something like that,
They would initiate an action that would require us to file Chapter 11, or that if we didn't have any other prospect, I think people around here were pretty convinced that something was going to happen, that we would preempt them from taking action by filing Chapter 11.
Okay.
And here again, I worked on Chapter 11.
So you knew what was going on that end?
What was going on that end?
Yeah. Let me turn the tape over. Okay, we're back on again. Can you talk a little bit about some other things that have impacted on the bargaining, or that may have? Do you think there was much effect on labor relations or the health of Eastern Airlines because of the PATCO problems in the early '80s? What I'm referring to is the PATCO strike, in which they replaced a whole bunch of air traffic controllers.
Do you mean from a direct effect upon the number of flights and the number of people we had working?
Yes.
Yeah, there's no question we had to pull back on it. I think, from my own personal point of view, and you probably could talk to people in our planning department, I feel that that helped us.
Oh.
I think what it did is delayed the competition from the low-cost carriers, because people had to reduce schedules, and they were frozen in 85%, as I recall, of what they were flying before, which included and precluded the low-cost carriers from really expanding the way they want. There were slot problems. There's still slot problems today. I think that if that didn't happen, and the capacity of the air traffic system was unlimited, we'd be in a heck of a lot worse fix than we are right now.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting way of looking at it. That in fact there was a benefit, because the other carriers, new carriers, could not get additional slots, could not get additional.
Yeah, they couldn't expand as fast as they would like to. And it may have helped them too. You know, I don't know. We could speculate by saying, hey, if they really did come after a particular large carrier all at once, then they probably would have got creamed all at once. So, you know, in the early stages of their startups. But we'll never know. I do think, though, it helped us.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about the machinists as an organization? You've already mentioned that they started, Charlie Bryan's new slate was doing their first negotiations when you entered negotiations in '81. Can you talk a little bit about that as an organization and its the political ebb and flow that goes on there?
I never really tried to get involved with their politics. I've often wondered how they got to be the way they are, and how we've gotten to our position as far as our relations with them. I can remember before I got into labor relations, I just couldn't believe the animosity between management and the IAM. As a matter of fact, I heard one of the fellows he was an officer, he was an officer in the personnel department, say that the management of this company hates the IAM.
Oh.
And I don't know where it started and how it got that way. I think it probably got there that way. You can speculate on a lot of reasons, but probably because our inability to say no to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always been, you know, I want to do this and nudge, and I want to do that and nudge, and before you know it, you've got people with more strength than you wish you had working for you in a particular department. I'm talking about in a particular unit. The manager in that particular department doesn't like it. He keeps biting his tongue, and all of a sudden he will take an action when somebody goofs up that's totally inappropriate, that reinforces that the management's no damn good. And then when he asks for counsel and is told what he has done is inappropriate, he mistakes good counsel for whitewashing, so he loses and becomes disillusioned with what he's got to deal with. And the next couple of times he'll look the other way, and when he's getting nudged again, and then he'll come back again with an inappropriate response, and it just seems to snowball and snowball and snowball. It's amazing how we've administered the contract over the years. And as I say, that would be a fascinating study to find out how the heck that started. I don't know how you ever would. But it would just be fascinating.
And you actually, before you got into negotiations, you weren't involved in grievance handling.
No.
You were not involved. But
Well,
what you're saying,
only from a disciplinary point of view. They had an article in the contract. It's still there. It's Article 18, which is the grievance procedure for people who are terminated or who are disciplined with loss of pay, and it became a credibility issue as far as people from the labor relations unit also who were involved with the decision making. They had a role in a first, I'll use the word hearing, a first phase hearing before an arbitration, to determine the facts and maybe mitigate them or overthrow the decisions. There was a problem, as I said, with credibility. How could somebody who was involved with one of those disciplinary things also hear it and be objective about it? So they asked, the company asked the personnel managers if they would do that, and I did that.
okay.
And I did all of them in Miami and in the Florida area.
So you did see him at that stage in the process.
Yeah, and by and large, I was disappointed. From the point of view that I thought a lot of the things, the disciplinary things at that time, were inappropriate. We would discipline people and we didn't do our homework, or it was a reaction, like I was saying before. The manager got nudged a couple of times and he would take an inappropriate action against an individual who had done some minor infraction.
Okay. So it was many were overreactions then.
Yeah, and I turned a lot of them over, and I was considered a good guy by the union at a point in time.
That whole relationship, though, and how it evolved, is an interesting one. You said that when Brian and his slate came in, '81, they had a lot of things, a long list of things they were going to change, long list of proposals. Was that based on a great deal of unrest within the membership, or where did that all come from? How did he get elected? Do you have any sense about that?
Well, those are two different items. I don't really have a lot of insight why he got elected, but I do know that the previous president and general chairman was at least perceived and at times accused of doing things that were not in the best interest of all of the membership. He had his own little clique that he would protect, and that he was acting at times with less than the credibility he should have, at least with his membership.
Mm-hmm.
And they resented it. And I think Brian had a particular problem with him. The previous president fired Brian at one time. and couldn't make that stick, and would not give him any. Brian was in Atlanta, as I recall, and wouldn't give him any clerical support in his office, for example. And whenever he wasn't in the office, phones would just ring, and it would. I think that Brian thought it, and I'm sure it did, reflected on his ability to respond to the people.
Mm.
So he came to the fore, but I think that probably the way some of the people felt about the previous president, other people could have run and
Okay.
and
So he was
succeed.
in the right place at the right time against a candidate who had become unpopular.
I think so.
Yeah. Is your sense that that Bryant maintains pretty good support from his membership?
That's hard to. It's hard to evaluate. At times I think he does, and at other times I don't. I think that right now I think his membership are probably very concerned. Don't know what's going to happen as far as the future is concerned.
Huh?
Concerned about right now, about 6 months from now when Texas Air takes control of Eastern, and 2 years down the road when their contract is up. At least that's what some of them tell me.
Uh-huh.
I think, I'm surprised. I thought the reaction against him would be more severe, and I've only heard limited criticism as far as Texas Air is concerned. I thought it would have been greater.
Uh-huh.
Not because of Texas Air, just anyone in particular coming along and buying Eastern because of an unwillingness to deal with the company.
Right.
But there's also a lot of people out there that he represents who feel the company has just been blowing smoke at them with their financial problems. And maybe they've got a point. Not so much as blowing smoke, but the credibility. We've trained people over the years, and I guess drummed it into them. Only in the last several years are we talking about yield. We used to talk about load factor, break-even load factors, and that's, since deregulation, that's all gone. You can have an 80% load factor and lose money if your yield is not right. And people constantly say to me, how could we be losing money when our load factor is 60%? And you've got to explain to them, well, it's like selling a dollar bill for 89 cents. Sooner or later, you're going to start losing money, but it's difficult when you're conditioned that way. And there hasn't been the events that would catch people's attention that we are losing money, like severe cutbacks on expenses and substantial layoff of people and cutbacks on routes.
Okay.
And so they don't see those.
Yeah.
those
Some sort of a dramatic thing like that would get their attention and say, oh, there must really be a problem here. Right? Okay. So it's the problem of limping along rather than having a one leg cut off or something like
That's
that.
right.
Uh-huh. Has the International been much help with the machinist leadership? I understand Peter Paul is here from time to time, has been involved in negotiations. Was that a helpful thing or not?
I have not personally met Peter Paul. He has been around. I've been around. I don't think he's really helped anything, as far as I could say. I think we have done a lot of wishing that he would help, but I don't see it. You really have to ask other people who have dealt with him personally on it. I don't think he helped us in '85 as far as the default on January 31. I don't think he helped at all. I think he was around here in January and February periodically. He may have been around the day preceding the sale of the company. I don't think he helped us there either. I don't know whether it was an unwillingness or an inability.
Basically, then, the way it has worked is that Charlie Bryant has called his own shots, really.
I think he had.
But, There have been some, you alluded to before, some cooperative efforts undertaken in which, employee involvement and that kind of matter. Through the sort of ups and downs that you've described, through the beginning 81, the up and the down and up and the down again, has that continued, or is that pretty much off again, on again thing?
Well, the employee involvement organization effort, I really think started in about 83, early 83.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been. When you're in negotiations, when you're having problems, that seems to die the involvement and the consideration, you're caring about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you reach an agreement, it seems to pick up gradually. There's still people who have pretty strong feelings on both sides and on what was done, and it takes a while, and then you get it back up, and then you get things like the wage investment program, the pre-wage investment program skirmishes over bankruptcy and what had to be done. And then you get into the wage investment program where people realize that we all have to work together to get where we want to go. And then you get in a situation in January 85 when dollars are withheld, and that it's deader than a doornail. So it's all over the lot.
Right. It's kind of a very human process then, that it reacts to every negative and positive thing that occurs, huh?
Absolutely.
You have some people here in, well, not in labor relations, but in the human resources function that give staff support and encouragement to that.
Yes.
Is that a very active group, or is that is that a part-time involvement those people have, or are they
No,
full-time?
they're full-time. I believe there's about 10 management people associated with that.
Oh, there.
And there's at least one full-time IAM and probably 3 or 4. Yeah, they're very active. They do a lot of training. They won't go out and actively come into the unit and say, we're here to do your EI training and get you involved with EI. It's a voluntary thing by the departments, but if they do, they'll go in and do an organizational diagnosis and determine what their needs are and training needs and how they could foster an EI spirit in there, and they'll work with them and coach them along.
Yeah, you mentioned that when you first went into negotiations in '81, that Andrews was your boss, and he was the one really handling those negotiations. At what point did he leave, and then later you referred to Johnson being in charge? What stage in the process did Johnson replace Andrews?
Well, Dwayne went all the way through from the 81 to the 83 negotiations in the fall, and was involved at least in the very initial stages of the fall of 1983.
Okay.
At that point, though, Dwayne was aware that the company was looking to bring in somebody else to handle labor relations areas, and Johnson, I believe, came in on October 1 of 83.
Oh, yeah.
The agreement, we agreed to agree and stop talking about bankruptcy, I believe, on the 13th of October. I may be off a couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest with you, I don't know whether Johnson or Dwayne was in that agreement to agree. I think it was Johnson.
Okay.
And then he moved in and took over as the guy who was chief, and Dwayne gradually moved into another area.
Mm-hmm. And what about your involvement with the IAM negotiations?
I've only been involved with the direct contract negotiations. For example, I was not involved in the wage investment program at all,
mm-hmm.
Or any discussions actually that occurred in October or September of 1985 as far as adjusting the contract wages for the full restoration of 86. I knew it was going on. I prepared a lot of the items. I wrote the draft of the agreement, but I was not sitting in a room with anybody while it was discussed.
Actually, who handles that now? Is Johnson the one that handles negotiations with the IAM?
Yeah.
If there should be some?
Right. Jack has the labor responsibilities for all the unions. But because of his involvement in '83 and in '84 and early '85, and I think he came to the realization in '84 there was no way that he was going to be able to turn that over. He had established at that time a rapport with Mr. Bryan, and I think he felt that he could best serve the company by negotiating with him directly as the chief negotiator. He did not do that with the flight attendants or the pilots.
Okay.
He was very much involved, but he was not
At the table
at
and
the
at
table
the
all the
spoke.
time.
Yeah. Throughout all this period from the summer of '83 on, have you been able to observe the role that USRI has played in this?
I'm not quite sure what role he plays. He's a behind the scenes type guy.
Yeah.
He seems to be able to get a lot of things done, but I don't know how he does it. Mirrors and smoke, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, the thing in the fall of '83 when there was an agreement to bring in the couple of
Yes,
financial people,
Locker,
teams.
Ebrecht,
Yeah.
and Lazard.
Yeah.
He was involved with that agreement.
Yeah.
And he was involved in the agreement to agree. That was part of that agreement to agree and stop talking about bankruptcy,
What's your impression about that? Did it, as a result of those outsiders coming in and taking a look at the books in effect and saying, well, it looks legitimate to me, there is a problem, did that change minds of people in the machinists? Was there kind of an aha, we now believe you?
I think it generally changed the minds of people and machinists. As I say, it's always baffled me a little bit because the guy that the machinist had as the consultant working on that was the same guy that apparently told him 6 months earlier that we had a lot of money. So it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Either he changes his mind quickly or we can make it and throw it away faster than anybody in the world.
Yeah. That is a puzzle, isn't it? That is a puzzle.
But I think, it helped as far as the credibility of Bryan and the leadership, because they had been making all these statements since '81 about the gloom and the doom and the unreported, unearned transportation revenue as a concept and how this was being used to the company manipulate the books. And so I think his membership, when he was able to go out and say, hey, we're going to have our own people study it, made sense in that context. And during the period of '81, '82, he had people going around. One of them was the president of the local here, Marty Ura, who was making speeches to IM membership and their wives and families at various locations saying, hey, the company's got plenty of money here, and here's how they're fooling you. And here's how they're fooling everybody else. And he was part of the talk show circuit as well.
Well, did
I
they
may
have
have a recording of that somewhere.
Oh, really? Huh? Of the talk show thing? Yeah.
No, of an actual presentation he did before.
Yeah. I'd be interested in that because I'm curious as to whether it's based on a real misunderstanding of the finance process, or they really did have some theory about where the money was being hidden or how you were discounting things, or I would be interested in seeing something like that because that is a puzzle to me.
We had a few of them around. I'll see if I can find one.
You don't hear that anymore, though, those kind of speeches.
Not lately.
You mentioned to me the first day that I met you that you're either already into or kind of embarking on a sort of a planning function for labor relations.
Embarking on it, really.
Okay.
What I have done since I've officially been in here has been things I think I mentioned to you that I wouldn't care to ever do again. That was to be involved with planning Chapter 11. I also have done research on the IM contract, but it all related to hopefully getting a new agreement, and if not, other courses of action that would be taken, which, were negative.
So what you would like to do, instead of that kind of planning, the planning that's just for negotiations or for potentially for Chapter 11, is to do a little anticipation of...
Get out in front of everything, yeah, right. There's a lot of things that I think, my job is broadly viewed, I think, by Jack Johnson, because he asked me for a lot of things, and sometimes I ask myself, why did he ask me for that? But I'm the guy he's relied on for a lot of that information since he's been here. But I think I can make it just about anything I want. And I think part of that function is to really make sure that people are trained and understand what's going on around them as far as the contract is concerned. And we haven't done enough of that over the years.
You mean like your first line supervisors and people like that, so that they... You referred before to them doing inappropriate actions in discipline and other things like that. And what you're saying is if they were trained properly, that kind of inappropriate behavior or interpretation of the contract would be minimized.
Yeah, and a lot of times, if you really ask my opinion about specific situations at the time, I'd say that they knew that they were inappropriate in certain instances, but they had gotten nudged too many times. And but they still felt that you weren't backing, that you were whitewashing them. I think there has to be a healthy respect for where we are, as far as unions are concerned, and what our role is in human resources, and what their role ought to be, and how you really get things done. There's a lot of work to be done in that area. A lot of work, computerized work, to be done too.
So you just would have better data in terms of what is going on. What kind of data, like you mean in terms of grievances that are handled, the way in which they're resolved?
Yeah, one of the things that we were talking about here, and we've started, has to be refined, is all system board cases come up through this office. And we've started putting them in a computer. We've got about a year's worth of history in there. That really is not good enough. We should have the grievances in there as well. But that's another little thing that we've got to be able to get our arms around so we can get them in. But it was my thought that we could use that data to determine where we have problems with certain sections of the contract.
Okay.
Instead of training the world, we go and train the department that needs it, or the manager that needs it, or shop steward that needs it. And we could resolve a lot of things that way.
Okay, that certainly makes a lot of sense. Would you say that your processing of grievances, and particularly on through arbitration, is fairly costly? I mean, is there potential for reducing your expenses a great deal by...
There's a potential for reducing expenses on it from a number of point of view. First of all, if you have people who don't know the contract, with the individualized cost center manager training, you could resolve it that way. You could also cut down on training our expenses on the EI involvement. It's amazing what you can do with grievances when people get along. I mean, manager or an employee may be doing exactly the same thing, but they've been able to sit down and talk it through and resolve it. And we saw that in '84, our grievances went to nothing. Well, they were about 80% down from the previous year. And when we get in little glitches, we can see where that takes us. Secretary here mentioned to me the other day that we have as many system board cases this year as we did all of last year already. And that's because of the first 3 months of this year.
Yeah.
The first 2 months, actually.
Yeah.
And there's things you can do by fostering an atmosphere and by training that could knock them way down.
So that's the role that you're staking out for yourself here with a planning function for labor management relations. Will your focus be initially on machinists and then expand into the other two areas?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, by necessity, I think that's had to be that way. Tom Clancy just joined Eastern 4 or 5 months ago. He really does not have the historical background as far as the machinists and their contract and what's going on over the years. So that's why I've been trying to be a support to that area.
Okay. He eventually will be taking over the machinists.
Well, he's got it.
Okay.
Except when he has difficulty understanding how something historically has been put together, I jump into it. Or when the Chapter 11 items, because of my involvement over the last 4 years, 4.5 years, and because of observations for 15 years before that, I was able to get in and do the Chapter 11 probably in a much shorter time span, do a lot of it, and it was a lot of work that he would take him months to do because he'd have to research everything.
Can you briefly describe what that is, the Chapter 11 work that you needed to do? What?
Well, there were a lot of scenarios. I'll tell you one scenario was that we had to do procedural manuals for all the different, and there's possibilities of a Chapter 11. We could have a pilot strike, a Chapter 11. And then you go into how you go into court and what you present to the court and how you put together procedures and proposals to meet and discuss with the union to come to a new contract, and if that didn't work, what you do then. The second scenario would be we'd go to Chapter 11 in a strike. And there's even themes off that. And everyone, there had to be half a dozen of them that we did.
Okay.
That started off differently, but ended up down the road
Okay.
in
I
a
see.
similar way.
Yeah. And in order to do that, you not only have to know the current labor relations, but you have to know the history of it. For instance, the history of do the machinists and the pilots cooperate on a thing like this? What would happen if the machinists went out with the pilots? So you being steeped in the history of what has transpired here puts you in a position where you could weave these scenarios as required. Huh? Interesting.
I've also been, I was involved with non-contract area, and one of the things I did was look at what we do with non-contract people. I was also a part of that.
Okay.
Because I've been involved with the contract negotiations. I knew what our objectives were. If we could get an agreement with the machinists, I was able to say, okay, here's what we do in the contract area, here's what I think are inappropriate, and we did do some inappropriate things in the non-contract area. And if we eventually want to change the contract here because it doesn't make any sense. If it doesn't make any sense here, it doesn't make any sense here. So I helped them structure and acted as the catalyst on structuring some of our non-contract, non-management.
Okay. You referred to when we were talking before earlier about productivity among the machinists, that that the culture here in the Miami base of the machinists is, by that I mean the mechanics, not the union, but the mechanics, that it just wasn't encouraging of getting things done in an expeditious way. That the do you have any? Can you understand why that is the case?
No, I know, and I wish I knew.
Yeah.
It still goes on.
Huh?
Our contract really, as far as this base is concerned, is not very restrictive. But it's always amazed me on how little productivity we can get when people don't want to work,
Mm-hmm.
and how we're not able to seem to get our arms around that. I remember looking at something a couple of years ago where we were working substantial amounts of overtime in one of our shops and weren't getting any parts out of it. Well, in reality, the employees in that shop control the production. And because it's not like a factory where you produce X number of widgets, they produce in that X thousand possibilities. And it was a repair and remanufacture or what have you function. So they would, being skilled workmen as they are, they would take the part, test it, determine what had to be done with it,
Mm-hmm.
which would also determine how much work they would have to do with it.
Okay.
Then they would determine what parts they needed to do. Now, if you want to play games, what you can do is determine what parts are available and what parts are not available. The parts that are not available will determine what you have to do on this gizmo over here
Okay.
if you don't
Okay.
particularly want to fix that.
So the clock goes on and the job doesn't get done, in effect.
No, I'm not saying that everybody on this base does it, but that's the driving force in a lot of departments. I mean, we really are not very productive.
So if you superimpose on that the problem you were talking about, where the manager maybe doesn't know what he should do with respect to discipline or enforcement of the contract, gets nudged, as you said, by the union a couple of times, and then acts out inappropriately, and then is not supported by management, that would be the supervisor's impression anyway. That individual supervisor is less likely to be energetic in overseeing people, in the
You're
sense of,
absolutely right.
in the sense of saying, come on, so-and-so, I know you can do that a little quicker here, why don't you do X, do this, that, the other thing. And because he's not overseeing the kind of employee behavior you're talking about is all the more allowed, in a sense.
Well, in a sense.
Yeah.
He may not even be aware of it in a lot of instances.
Okay. Without not being close to the situation, you would not necessarily be aware of it. Certainly, what you described, though, as the culture there, if you could introduce things like employee involvement, it could ultimately change that kind of thing, where people would feel a part of it, pride in what they're doing, happy to have a good product going out the back door.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that must be a source of frustration to you.
Source of frustration, everybody on this base, really.
This is the largest place, too, isn't it, where you have?
Yeah, this is the overhaul base.
This is, okay, so you do have more mechanics, repair people here, yeah, than anyplace else. Yeah, that would be do you have any plans for that, ultimately, in your planning as to how to get an arm on that?
No. I've seen a lot of proposals over the last couple of years on how to do that, but it would take a lot of different thinking, one of which was that, for example, on the testing of this piece of equipment, is that you would test the equipment and advise your foreman or whoever, or the planner there, who would help you go along with that testing and determine what you needed with it. And So, and that you couldn't squirrel away parts, which a lot of people do. You know, they'll do 99% of this and put it away, and when overtime comes, miraculously,
It shows up.
Yeah, it's amazing what we can do on overtime sometimes. But that would take a lot of restructuring. I think from what I've seen, and I'm not by any means an expert in there. It would take a restructuring of the shops and part flows and how they get work, and it can be done. It can be done.
Someplace I had heard that Joe Leonard, his name escaped me for a minute, that when he was hired, he was in charge of the repair base here, and that there was a lot of satisfaction expressed in his performance. Is that because he got along with the machinists well, or what did he do, or do you know?
I think the machinists respect Joe because he's honest and straightforward. I think he knows what he's doing, and it was interesting to watch him when he was in the operations services group because he knew what was going on, and he knew what was going on all over. You know, his background, I guess, his technical background, and his directness and his ability to determine when somebody was blowing smoke at him. It just all seemed to click and work very well. It was amazing what our results were. Incredible.
So for a time there was some improvements in the.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. But as you say, the problem is that all these external forces influence it as well, like the profitability in the latter part of '85, and then the company again sort of singing a song, well, we need some concessions because revenues are down, and the reaction of the membership is
It puts
negative.
well, it could be conscious or unconscious. I think, you know, that as you go through these ups and downs through the years, you say, my God, what's next? And it's deflating, you know, and I think the production in this building we're in, I don't think was appropriate in January and February. I mean, people working on Chapter 11 were working like a son of a gun, but, you know, there were a lot of people sitting around, and I'm sure it was the shops, of what's going to happen, and speculating on the next move or the next newspaper article, or did you see what was in the Herald yesterday? And it was just...
The wheels are all turning on rumors.
It just wasn't an atmosphere, an environment that would lead to a lot of productivity.
I've run through most of the things that I was going to ask you about, and we're getting near the end of the tape. Got another 7 or 8 minutes. Are there some things that you didn't get to talk about that you'd like to?
I can't really think of anything that I wanted to go into. I mentioned that I've always thought it would be fascinating for somebody to look at how the hell we got where we do as far as our employee relations are concerned. I'm not sure that would help, but it probably would. Probably would.
Yeah, an appreciation of history, I think, is important. Understand, just as your own personal history is important, how you got to become who you are. The same is probably true with the labor relations here. It's just probably a lot more complicated than your personal history. You know, so many actors, you know, so many events and other things that it can influence it.
Well, one of the things, you know, that I don't think I mentioned is that during that '83, prior to the strike deadlines, the company did produce a lot of question and answers that to try and dissuade the IM membership and communicated directly with them, that I thought was ultimately determined to be rather negative. It turned people off rather than convincing them. They were going to follow their leadership, and whatever the company did just reinforced what the leadership had told them, that the company's out to give you the business, and there is money out there.
That's really unfortunate, because I assume that the communications being made directly with the members by Eastern was done in good faith, with the best of intentions of informing,
Well, yeah, they were. It was that intention of getting them to ratify that contract
Right.
without taking us to the cleaners.
Yeah.
And that's the best intention, but it was turned
was
to
not
be a
effective.
big negative.
Yeah, not effective.
And when we didn't go on strike, as I said before, with the kamikazes, that turned a lot of people off.
Yeah.
I mean, in the management, and they said, hey, this is all a bunch of malarkey. We were led down a garden path, and here's what you did for them, and you told us you couldn't do this. It was a big credibility problem.
Yeah. It's easy. Now, in hindsight, that's easy to see how they would perceive it that way, isn't it? That, as I understand it, there was even some cross-training of people to
Quite a bit of question.
handle jobs in anticipation of a strike. And so if you train me to handle the ramp or whatever, and I'm ready, I'm
We had
committed.
you all fired up. We had you trained, and we had you in Houston, ready to go. We're going to operate this, and these people that you have considered to be a thorn in your side are going to be on the street, and you're going to be there making this company work without them, and we're going to show you.
Do you think on the machinist side that all that preparation that Eastern engaged in for a strike, did it cause them to have any second thoughts? Did they begin to blink?
I don't think so. I don't know.
And as I understand it, had there been enough funds, enough of a cash flow to take a few weeks of strike, they might have taken it.
We'll never know.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. Well, I think on that speculative note, I'll tell you thanks, and if I have more, I'll come back and talk to you. Okay?
Anytime.
Thank you.